What you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences. And I've always sort of found you would see things that you would not automatically have come across.
Hello and welcome to the Parliamentary Review podcast, the podcast that puts leadership in focus. I'm Scott Challoner, and I'm here to introduce your podcast host, Jonathan White, who each week is joined by directors, CEOs, CFOs, government ministers, chairmen, presidents, maybe one day even the President of the United States. That is, if he still is the president by then. The aim is to discover who these people are who get up every morning and make the world work. Everything is up for discussion, including the future of British trade deals, to government reforms, to the Court of Appeals, and of course the innovation and success in the country that makes it all worthwhile in the end. We also discuss their take on the current economic and political state of the country. Later on, you'll have the chance to hear Jonathan White's exclusive interview with Lord Pickles, the former Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, Chairman of the Conservative Party, and of course current co-chairman of the Parliamentary Review. But for now, Jonathan joins Jane Board, Director and Consultant Nurse Practitioner at Lymphoedema Specialist Services. Its mission is to deliver specialist treatment to adults with all types of lymphedema and chronic edema. The company, based in Eastbourne, East Sussex, has been carrying out its work since its foundation in 2011. Jane herself has 23 years' experience in the provision of lymphedema care, including the development of 7 lymphedema services in South East England. So, without further ado, I hand you over to Jonathan White and Jane Board over in Westminster.
Jane, welcome.
Hello, Jonathan. No, thank you for this time.
Thank you very much for joining us today. It is a pleasure, and I thought it might be a wonderful place to kick things off, especially for the listeners who I know will be interested. Yourselves, we should say, founded now back in 2011, almost 10 years ago. What was the initial inspiration behind doing so, Jane?
The inspiration behind doing this, Jonathan, was primarily from the 2012 Health Act that enabled people such as myself to be contracted by the NHS and provide a service in possibly a little bit more of an innovative way, whereby we were contracted by the NHS, but we could provide a service with a little bit more detail, a little bit more of a comprehensive treatment attached to it outside of the NHS because of their confines.
And what a success it's been in the meantime. It's something that must be exceptionally rewarding with, of course, its challenges, Jane. And with that in mind, actually, what have been the major challenges you've had to confront over the last 10 years or so?
The major challenges have been the capacity to provide treatment in the way that myself and my colleague Julia and Anderson have wanted to do during this time. Lymphedema is a chronic condition that cannot be cured. So unfortunately, what has happened over time is that new patients with lymphedema have been referred to Lymphoedema Specialist Services. But unfortunately, we've not lost patients the other end. By that, I'm meaning being discharged. So what tends to happen with all lymphedema services, not least our own, is that we have more and more patients not necessarily discharging patients the other end, which meant, of course, this presented with a resource issue. People's treatment was at risk of being diluted as we needed to accommodate more and more patients. And that was the reason, in summary, some 18 months ago, that we made the decision not to renew our NHS contract so that we could become more proactive with our treatment as opposed to being a bit on the back foot, treating patients as best we could, but wanting to get rid of that and being more proactive, treating patients.
Absolutely, because really that's what it's all about, isn't it, Jane? And I would like to perhaps say perhaps tell us a little bit more about it, because I think for the general public and general population as a whole, it's not perhaps out of all the other conditions that are known, lymphedema is not something that is well known at all, in fact. And perhaps in terms of education, it's not to the point where people know how to deal with this, perhaps at all.
That's right. Lymphedema is a chronic condition that cannot be cured. And the condition itself is the buildup of fluid just underneath the surface of the skin. It's lymph fluid that results in swelling that becomes quite visual. It can occur anywhere in the body. It usually occurs when there's a problem with the drainage capacity of the lymphatic system and is often associated with cancer or the effects of cancer treatment, where the cancer infiltrates the tissues or the impact of radiotherapy can damage those drainage pathways and fluid accumulates.
Now, one of the reasons behind, of course, you not renewing your NHS contract, apart from being, of course, being proactive, is because it became evident, didn't it, that patients were experiencing delays in receiving treatment promptly.
That's right. Indeed, that was the case. And as we had more and more patients that were referred, that naturally had an impact on resources in trying to treat patients as promptly as we could, but at the same time wanting to give them the treatment that quite rightly they deserved. And often we felt intention of trying to treat everybody as best we could, but not having the time, the capacity to do so.
And one of the great challenges, of course, Jane, when it's a small team that you have, is being able to balance the treatment of patients and, of course, what is and will always be an administrative burden on the organisation.
That's right, indeed. The burden in terms of, yes, the data collection that's most necessary for the NHS, for they to measure how well any service, not least ours, is delivering a contract for them. Basically, that measure fundamentally that quality of care is being delivered. But that can be difficult with a condition that is chronic.
Now, I understand, of course, as well, Jane, you have a rather special guest with you today.
That's right. I do, Jonathan. I have a lady called Holly who is the daughter of one of our long-standing patients who unfortunately passed away. Holly's mother, known as Charlie, developed lymphedema as a consequence of cancer, and the swelling was quite severe in nature. And it was myself and my colleague Julia that wanted to treat as best as we possibly could by putting in that care that Charlie needed, whilst at the same time, unfortunately, Charlie's cancer developing into advanced disease, where eventually she passed away. And it was the impact of lymphedema and the quality of her life in terms of her being able to enjoy a quality of life as she reached the final stages of her life. Holly and her family were gracious enough to us as a company in recognising what we were trying to do, that when Charlie did pass away, they kindly donated some of the money that was raised from the donation of the funeral for us as a company to treat lymphedema in a proactive way. In other words, to see people who are at risk of developing lymphedema, as opposed to what Charlie experienced when she was referred to us when the lymphedema was firmly established. And this is what's been so wonderful, our relationship with Holly, partnership working with her and her family with this wonderful donation as we launch now with a preventative model of care.
And I should tell listeners as well, in fact, just logistically, of course, we're doing this over the telephone. So as we speak to Holly now, Jane will pass over the phone and then we'll be passed back later. But it would be a pleasure to speak to Holly, I think.
Yes, thank you, John. We'll duly do so. It'd be a pleasure to do.
Hello.
Hello, Holly. Thank you very much for taking the time today. And
Thank you.
joining us. No, it's an absolute pleasure. And I would quite like to ask, because as Jane's put it so well, how much did it mean to you, and indeed your late mother, that you had a team like Jane's and their specialist services there when you needed them?
It's quite hard to put into words, really, how much they helped us as a family. So it's quite hard not to get upset.
Of course. And it's obviously genuinely emotional, but I think that just goes to show how much they did mean to you, Holly. Because without what they did, it sort of, it's hard to think otherwise, actually, isn't it? And I know it is emotional, so I don't want to put you on the spot here, Holly. But what would you say, perhaps, if I can ask, to others that perhaps in your situation? What advice would you give them?
I think that going back to your previous question, Jane and Julia were referred to by us as a family as Charlie's Angels, because they helped us so much and they helped Mum with her lymphedema. If I was to give anybody any advice, it would be to use the resources that are around you to try and prevent and help you as a family, because I can't even put into words how much they helped us.
Look, I don't want to put you on the spot any further, but look, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and hopefully we can see you again very soon. But thank you, Holly.
Thank you.
Jane, if that's Jane again there?
It is,
Excellent.
yes.
And I think the listeners will know from Holly's answer there at how much not only you and your team meant to Holly and her late mother, but how important and how necessary this sort of care is, and for people who wouldn't even think they might even imagine they would need it one day.
That's right. Thank you for giving us the opportunity and for Holly sort of to support this ethos, this preventative model whereby, with the donation that Holly's family so graciously have given, have enabled us to buy a gadget, a handheld device, whereby we can be seeing people at risk of developing the condition, and in doing so, hopefully prevent or at least control a lymphedema at its early stages of development wherever possible.
Now, in terms of the science, Jane, you'll have to excuse me, as a layman myself, the great hope obviously rests in this preventative model. In terms of the science as things stand, what sort of success rates can we be thinking about, Jane? And how practical is the model?
The two good questions there, Jonathan. In terms of the success rate, we do believe we are pioneers with this in the country in terms of a service that's dedicating itself to this preventative approach. NHS services, as far as we know, and we do work at national level, which enables me to say with a sense of confidence, as far as we know, lymphedema services provided by the NHS operate from an impairment-based approach. In other words, patients walk through the door for that first appointment when lymphedema is already present. We're wanting to flip that model around whereby we go and see somebody that may well be at risk of developing. We give them the education, we give them advice on preventing, and most importantly, a contact of who they can see should they feel they're developing the condition as opposed to waiting. So with regards to your next question, what is the success rate? I'm sorry to say we can't really say at this moment because, by definition, this is a new model. We would envisage at least 3 years' worth of data before we can do any credible reporting, so to speak. That tends to be the minimum data time period for any research on anything within medicine before we can report. But we have every intention of doing that, of reporting now, minimally in 3 years.
Jane, I'm already conscious of the time. It's catching up with us already. So if I may, perhaps if we can take a quick step back and look at the sector more broadly. We do have a new government with a large majority and one that will hopefully not be obsessed with Brexit since we've left the European Union and might be able to focus on other things, for example, health policy. From your perspective, Jane, what priorities would you like to see the government pursue, especially when it comes to things that matter most to you?
Thank you for saying that. The NHS brought out a big policy in 2019, the long-term plan, NHS plan, where the focus of this model is on prevention. And this was most timely for us as a company, having released ourselves, not renewed our NHS contract at the very time that this big policy came out. We are very blessed with local commissioners that recognise and very much saw the need for our model of care because, if nothing else, it supported this preventative approach. But unfortunately, it's boiled down to money in terms of the lack of those finances to support us as a company of being able to operate this from an NHS perspective, leaving us no option but to do it in a private capacity. So the policy is there for the NHS, from NHS England, who actually wrote that policy, which is hugely embedded with prevention. But unfortunately, the money does not appear to be there to follow that policy through.
Well, I think you speak for an awful lot of people, Jane, when you point that out. And let us hope that that is pursued with relish in the next few months. But I'm afraid time really has beaten us now. Before we end, though, Jane, I think perhaps just let's turn back to yourselves at Lymphoedema Specialist Services one more time. You've started down a very exciting path, and there are so many people wishing you all the success. Where do you hope the business will be in 12 months or so, Jane?
In 12 months' time, Jonathan, I'd like to see this new preventative model care approach for the treatment of lymphedema embedded in all NHS lymphedema services. So LSS, Lymphoedema Specialist Services, would be rolling it out across the country and with it being supported by NHS funding and in accordance with the NHS long-term plan of 2019. And I cannot think of a better, more fitting tribute to Charlie who's no longer with us, unfortunately, and respect to her family who've so kindly given us the donation to actually start this project off.
Well, as we finish, Jane, perhaps I could ask you to put us on speaker just as we finish the show, because that way I'm able to say to both Jane and Holly, not only thank you very much for joining us today, and thank you for your time, but the whole team and indeed every listener will wish you both well for the future. Thank you both.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for your time. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
I hope you all enjoyed Jonathan White's interview with Jane, and especially learning more about the challenges facing the sector and how the whole team at Lymphoedema Specialist Services continues to raise standards. If you've not heard it before, coming up now is Jonathan's conversation with the Parliamentary Review's co-chairman, Lord Eric Pickles. Lord Pickles served as Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government in David Cameron's cabinet before receiving a peerage back in 2018. Lord Pickles remains active as the United Kingdom's anti-corruption champion and the Special Envoy for post-Holocaust issues. I hope you enjoy listening just as much as Jonathan enjoyed speaking to Eric. Here it is now.
Lord Pickles, thank you very much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
Now, I'm sure you won't mind me reminding the listeners that you've been involved in politics, both local and national, for quite a number of decades. Indeed, before the days we were in the common market. Given your experience over those years, what thoughts have you had over the last few weeks and months about the current political situation the country finds itself in?
Situation is quite dire because we have a parliament that is by and large useless. It's like a bored teenager on a long drive, and it knows what it doesn't want, and it's so bored with Brexit, but it can't agree. So no matter what you put up, it's against it. Are you in favour of a referendum? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of remaining within the single market? No, I don't want that. Are you in favour of... No, I don't want to do that. No. And are you in favour of leaving without a deal? No, we don't want to do that. So it's against everything, but there isn't enough votes to be in favour of something. And it could be by the time this podcast goes out that Boris has started on the process of the bill, because we'll be voting on that today. But even then, what people don't seem to understand, this is not the end of Brexit.
Right.
This is barely opening the door of Brexit. We've got years of negotiations about trade agreements, relationships with Europe, putting down pieces of legislation. We get our agriculture, our fisheries, our financial services into place. Brexit is going to go on and on and on and on.
Forward to it.
I'm sure we are.
Now, the question is, I should actually remind listeners that we are talking on the day that the second reading of the European Withdrawal Act will take place. So as we speak, we don't quite know. As perhaps like the government front bench don't know what's going to happen. You compare Parliament to a petulant teenager. What do you do to a petulant teenager to sort it out? Is there a chance that it will see sense and push this through this bill without making amendments? Is there a chance it will vote for its own for a general election? How do you see this playing out at the moment?
The sensible thing will be to put this deal through, because I've always been of the view a deal is better than no deal, because this is just the beginning. In order to start the process of Brexit, start the process of the United Kingdom taking over powers that it's not really exercised for 40 odd years, the smart thing is to get this thing through now. But in a way, it's not about Brexit itself. If there was a free vote, this deal would have gone through. Mrs May's deal would have gone through. But it's about politics. It's about a Labour Party that thinks it has a chance, trying to make the Prime Minister, whether it was Theresa May or Boris Johnson, look as though that they are in office but not in power, of delaying as long as possible. There's a lot of talk about an election in the autumn, maybe back end of November, beginning of December. Something for us to look forward to before Christmas. It's beginning to look less likely. It's beginning to look as though they might want to drag it into spring to get as far away as possible from the rather decisive moment that Boris came back with a deal. We have to remind ourselves that nobody thought he could deliver a deal, and it does quite shock them. And if you remember, all this process went through in order to ensure that we're left without a deal. When we have a deal, suddenly, well, no, it's not that kind of deal. We don't want that kind of deal. We want something different.
I think the vast majority of people in this country, whether Remain or Leave, now would be very satisfied for this to come to a amiable conclusion. And as correctly just said, because when it does come to those in the opposition who claim to want this to end, and then introduce wrecking amendments, they introduce new objections to it, the general public are getting quite frustrated.
But you've got to understand that quite a lot of people don't get beyond a small area within Westminster, sometimes cliche referred to as the Westminster bubble, and go back to their own patch. Now, by and large, everybody hates their MP, except when they're at home, doing the fairs, wandering around, helping people. So they, in a way, they're cosseted to that great, which I feel is coming as a tsunami of change.
You were, of course, MP for Brentwood for
25 years.
Absolutely. What would you, of course, you resident there as well, despite being a proud Yorkshirean, obviously, representing a good Essex seat. What would you say to your old constituents right now? Hang in there, it'll be all right?
Well, it's different when you're a member of Parliament because, you've got to kind of toe the government line a little bit. So one thing I found now is I've got my weekend back and I say what I want. And I think I always say to our constituents is that it is pretty hopeless down there.
Excellent. Well, on that, I think, honest assessment, it's something I think the Parliamentary Review has always done quite well, talking frankly about problems, issues, and also not just good practice, but leadership. Well,
I was used to read it when I was a member of Parliament, because, what you want more than anything is you want to meet people with different experiences, and I've always sort of found it quite a kind of a chatty magazine, but also you would see things that you would not automatically have come across. I certainly have attended the receptions over the year, and it's amazing the things you kind of pick up.
And I think it's important to stress it's not because politicians are uninterested, because honestly, as you'll know more than anyone, it's an issue of time. And to be able to have a channel and a platform where you can keep communication lines between businesses, schools and policymakers is so exceptionally important.
No, I think so, and it's important that it's beholden to nobody. People, pay to be part of the publication, pay to be members, and it's a way of not beholden to government, not beholden to anything.
Now, echoing the words, of course, your fellow chairman, Lord Blunkett, has said, what some might not know is that you started your political journey perhaps even further left than David Blunkett.
Oh, absolutely, I was a communist.
Now, what was it?
At the age of 14, I was bought the Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution, and I read it from cover to cover. I tried to read it a few years back, and I just couldn't follow anything.
So I was going to say perhaps you might know the minds of the show front bench better than they do themselves.
From my position when I first joined, I would regard them as recalcitrant running dogs of the capitalist system.
Now, what was it then that moved you from radical Marxist to running the only inner city council controlled by the Conservatives in the 80s?
Well, I was very young, and I was fascinated by what was happening in what was then Czechoslovakia and Dubček, and the revolution that was taking place there inside communism, and the way in which he was repressed by Mr. Brezhnev, and the tanks and taking over. I was so angry. And I'm 16, remember. I'm really angry. And I thought, what's the most outrageous thing I can do? I will join the Conservative Party as a protest. And I kind of sticked around. My family thought it was the funniest thing that ever happened to us. I was Eric the Tory. And
I think you announced this quite grandly as a grand protest.
I did indeed. But, I kept going down, and it was an exciting time. People were developing the ideas of what the Conservative Party should be. Selsdon man, even Heath looked radical. We had different ideas, and it eventually clicked. And at some point, I became a Conservative, and that was 51 years ago. I think I'm definitely 100% a Tory now.
Through and through.
Through and through.
Although I do know the story, most people might guess that a dialogue Conservative like yourself would have perhaps a portrait of Mr. Thatcher or Mr. Churchill in their office. But who is it that you have?
I had Che Guevara. Which I always had him over my left shoulder for visitors, and they always used to you see their eyes going up and thinking, who can't possibly be it. Someone asked me if it was Desi Arnaz. I thought it was married to Lucille Ball. But no, the reason I did that was to remind me and to remind my officials that without constant vigilance, the cigar-chomping commies would take over.
I'm sure David Bump was in the room to reply to that, actually. But in that long journey, you eventually ended up, of course, in 2010, doing something most Conservatives would never thought they would have to do, but in a coalition government with, of all people, the Liberal Democrats.
That's right.
Now, something I think perhaps today more than ever, people and our politics seems to be almost wholly determined on how we voted in a referendum 3 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, the most normal thing would happen after something like that would be the country would come together, and if anything, we're more divided. I mean, I thought working in the coalition, I'm proud to have been part of that coalition. I'm proud to have worked alongside the Liberal Democrats, who I think realised that, like all minority partners in a coalition, they would suffer at the polls.
Do you think we've lost the ability recently as a people to work with those that we might disagree with on issues more than we used to?
I'm not sure that's right. I mean, you can see various members of the Conservative Party working closely with Liberal Democrats and Labour to defeat their own government, but it's not a thing I think I would want to encourage.
Quite. And I should remind listeners, we are recording this in Victoria, just over the road at Cardinal Place, a fantastically new development site which wouldn't have been there without some of your legislation. What was the proudest?
I personally approved it.
Absolutely. What was the proudest moment, do you think, in serving Secretary for 5 years?
It's my actual proudest moment. We did a thing called Troubled Families, which was the first centre-right attempt to deal with poverty and to deal with difficult families that were causing a disproportionately large amount of call upon the state, and it was on the basis of tough love. It's on the basis of getting people into jobs. It's about dealing with the family as a whole, not just one or two individuals that were having a problem. And I'm pleased that it's continued.
And since, I should very much stress that since, of course, you're stepped down being an MP, you do have your weekends back, but that's not to say you haven't remained very active and very busy. Of course, continues the government's anti-corruption champion, shone the harsh light of day over malpractice in the local government. Indeed, the Queen's speech we've just had includes some of your recommendations from 2016. I think a couple of things on that. First of all, are you surprised? I may imagine you may not be at some of the backlash towards in this country introducing voter ID for voting.
It is absurd, and it's particularly absurd coming from the Labour Party, because it was largely Labour's vulnerability that got my interest in trying to do something about it. And it's a bit like saying, you're requiring people to show some ID, that this is suppressing voting. It's a bit like saying the post office is suppressing parcels because they demand to see some ID. I think they've got a bee into their bonnet that this is something like that goes in the state to repress. It's not. It's about giving confidence to the system. Now, the Electoral Commission and foreign observers have warned us for such a long time that our electoral system is vulnerable. And it's to misquote John Major, we are really sort of old males cycling to evensong and Warburn. Yeah, I mean, it's such a basic thing. It's an important thing. And it was kind of interesting in some of the trials. They did a focus group with a bunch of young Asian girls. And they said they thought the process of a photo ID would actually give them a greater confidence in the fairness of the system. I make all kinds of recommendations to stop postal vote harvesting, to stop various fraud taking place, to stop intimidation at counts, to stop intimidation outside polling stations.
I think you referenced it earlier, the Westminster bubble. A lot of the places where this occurs and the places where this does go on are places where perhaps many members, many people in the press don't usually go to.
No, they don't. We saw a YouGov poll that said the overwhelming majority, well in the 60%, thought this idea was sensible.
Yeah, and I imagine you're quite proud that recommendation is in the speech.
Yes, I mean, I'm a bit frustrated they didn't do it sooner, but nevertheless, I'm very happy that they are doing it.
It's as if the government's time has been taken up by something else and we've not focused on anything domestic.
Absolutely.
But with a man, though, with his roots in local government, do you think, and how much you've worked with that report, especially looking at them carefully, how would you rate our current state of local municipal politics?
Local government's very good. I mean, local government, don't get me wrong, it's by and large corruption free, and it does a remarkably good job. And it was, in truth, my worries about local government and that these measures were brought in. I don't believe the fraud is big enough to be able to take a parliamentary seat, but it is big enough to take a council. And if you are negligent, uncaring about the probity of the poll, you're likely to be equally negligent about the awarding of contracts to your friends. So it's all past that. But local government is a very enduring part of our constitution. I got a bit stick because we had to take some money from them, but by and large they survive very well.
Excellent. Now, beyond obviously that work, you're also, of course, the British envoy for post-Holocaust issues.
Yeah, sure.
Very dear to your heart. I know you've done some fantastic work recently, including with obviously former Shadow Chancellor from the Review, Ed Balls. Would you mind, if you could just let the listeners know what projects you are working with and really the importance that has to so many communities around the country?
Well, I used to be very unpleasant about Ed Ball, and he used to be very unpleasant about me. But I found working with him remarkably easy, and we've not had a single row in 2 years, and by now we're beginning to be able to finish each other's sentences. We're building a memorial to the Holocaust next to Parliament with a learning centre below it, and the reason why the Prime Minister chose that site is that it was David Cameron, and he wanted to ensure that when people left the memorial, they would look and see Parliament and recognise that it was the last bastion against tyranny. But more important, to remind people who work in Parliament that that the legislature has a choice. It can either protect its citizens or it can oppress its citizens. And we do know that that it was a compliant legislature that brought in the Nuremberg laws. And at a time when there are parts of Europe that are seeking to rewrite their history and seeking to see themselves as only the victims of the Nazis, I'm determined that we should tell the truth in an unblinking way. We are, I suppose, at a critical crossroads when the last survivor is likely to be no longer with us within the next decade and a half. And at that point, we do know that history starts to be reassessed. I think it was Simon Sharma that talked about this. And he was referring to the French Revolution. And of course, most of the books written in the 1850s are the ones that have shaped our view of the French Revolution. But the difference is this, that slightly over 100 years ago, my grandfather Edgar grabbed hold of his Lee Enfield and walked out of a trench in the Somme and walked towards the Germans. And within a few minutes, most of the people he'd been brought up with, most of his friends were dead. Nobody doubts that he did that. But there's a whole industry out there that doubts that the Holocaust took place. So that's why it's important that we help frame that narrative.
And you reference as well, it's so important, especially at this time of history, so many years afterwards, that young people in schools get the correct education about it. How do we compare as a country in doing that compared to some of our European friends?
We I think, compare remarkably well, particularly because we've got a mixture of things. We ensure through the lessons of Auschwitz that 2 pupils from every secondary school go to Auschwitz each year, that they have a preliminary meeting, a visit and a wrap-up. We ensure that Holocaust Day is remembered in January. Now, I can remember starting that, or I'm not starting it, but being part of a foot soldier of people that put it together. And, it was like one man and a dog, but now it's quite a massive, it's a massive event. So I think we are quite good at remembering that. I think where we perhaps do need to have a wider understanding is beyond the death camps. And we need to kind of understand the Einsatzgruppen, which was the roving murder squads, how important they were. You were more likely to have been shot in a ditch than to end up in a death camp. The hinterland of that is Lithuania, where I was last week talking to colleagues, and through Belarus and the Ukraine. And it's really important that we ensure that we register where those death sites are.
And I think certainly, and I'm going to sit down next to speak, which hopefully won't be too long away. I think we'd be very happy to keep updates on how that project is going, because it's so important and people do need to be aware of it. Looking to the future, though, I imagine you were actually very content and happy because former Prime Minister, friend and colleague David Cameron just released his book, and you were quite unscathed from it.
I came out, it was very nice about it. I even bought the audio version because he was reading it, and he obviously, but there was a fair bit of affection, and I'm rather glad they left out 1 or 2 of the other embarrassing things.
Maybe another time.
Yeah.
Yes, but it's important, I think, and I'm conscious of the time, but I think it's important that today people have become so perhaps caught up in what's happening in this country regarding Brexit. Looking to the future, what would you say that it's a positive thing that this country has to look forward to?
Well, we're a large trading nation. We're a large economy. We're a liberal democracy, and it would be good to get through Brexit over the coming years, and it would be good to start to look at some of the social issues that we need to tackle, those that have been left behind by our economic progress. And it will be good to see some solid investment in this country, both in terms of its infrastructure, but also in terms of the way it operates as a democracy.
And I know that's going to be a huge focus of the next review. Well, Pickles, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
As always, it has been a pleasure listening to our guests and learning from them. I and Jonathan hope you all enjoyed listening. Until next time, Jonathan and I are off to the Westminster Arms to raise a glass to raising standards. No, of course, it is closed. So Jonathan's front room will unfortunately have to do.
Thank you for listening to our podcast. You can find every episode on iTunes, YouTube, and Spotify. The views expressed by each guest in the podcast are their own. They do not represent the opinions of the Parliamentary Review, Westminster Publications, Lord Pickles, Lord Blunkett, David Curry, or any other guest on the podcast. If you'd like to know more about the Parliamentary Review, please visit www.theparliamentaryreview.co.uk.